On a morning in the year 1000, a man stood on the deck of a warship called the Long Serpent, and the Long Serpent was the largest warship anyone in Scandinavia had ever built. 160 oars, 34 benches, a gilded dragon head rising from the prow, its eyes inlaid with polished stone that caught the weak September sun. The man who stood on its deck was 32 years old. He was tall, even by Norwegian standards, which meant he towered over most of the men who would kill him today. His hair was the color of wheat stubble in autumn. His hands, which had held the throats of pagan priests and the chins of jarls as he forced baptismal water into their mouths, were wrapped around the hilt of a sword he would never surrender. Around him, the water of the Øresund was crowded with ships, but the ships were not his. They belonged to 3 kings who had come to this narrow strait between Denmark and Sweden for the specific purpose of ending him. Svein Forkbeard of Denmark, who wanted Norway back under Danish control. Olaf Tryggvason of Sweden, who wanted the same for Sweden. Erik Håkonsson, the exiled Norwegian jarl whose father Olaf had overthrown and whose people Olaf had tortured into conversion. Between them, they commanded somewhere between 70 and 100 ships. Olaf had 11. He'd been sailing home from a failed diplomatic mission to Poland, where he had tried to negotiate an alliance through marriage when the trap closed. The ships emerged from behind the islands. The wind died, as it does in straits. The oars splashed, the distance shrank. And Olaf Tryggvason, king of Norway, looked out at the fleet that would destroy him and did not run. He could have. The Long Serpent was fast. Some of his smaller ships broke and fled, 3 or 4 of them, scattering south toward the open Baltic where pursuit would be difficult. Olaf let them go. He ordered the remaining ships lashed together, gunwale, to form a floating platform. He placed the Long Serpent at the center, the position of greatest honor and greatest danger. And then he waited for the largest naval battle in Viking history to begin. What happened next would become legend within a generation and remain legend for 1,000 years. The poets who survived it, and there were poets present because there were always poets present when kings expected to do something worth remembering, would describe a battle that lasted from morning until afternoon, fought across decks slicked with blood, with arrows so thick they darkened the sky, with Olaf himself standing at the stern of the Long Serpent as ship after ship was cleared of defenders, as the platform shrank, as his men died in heaps around him, until at last the enemy gained the deck of the flagship itself. At which point the King of Norway raised his shield over his head, stepped backward off the stern, and fell into the water in full armor. His body was never recovered. The sea does not give up its dead easily, and the Øresund in particular keeps what it takes. Men dove for him. Boats circled the spot where he had vanished. But Olaf Tryggvason, who had been sold into slavery at the age of 3, who had risen to become a prince of the Rus and a captain of raiders and the first Christian king of a pagan nation, disappeared beneath the surface and did not come up. Some said he drowned, some said he escaped, that he slipped his armor underwater, swam beneath the enemy ships, and emerged on some distant shore to live out his days as a monk in the Holy Land. A century later, people were still claiming to have seen him. 2 centuries later, the poets were still writing about his return. The uncertainty was part of the point. A man like Olaf Tryggvason could not simply die. He had to vanish, leaving a space in the world shaped exactly like himself. But the question that matters, the question that makes his story worth telling across 1,000 years of distance, is not how he died. It is how he lived, how a child sold into slavery became the king who brought Christianity to Norway by fire and blade. How a man who could barely read came to remake the spiritual landscape of an entire civilization. And how the methods he used to accomplish that remaking, the forced baptisms, the mutilations, the burnings of pagan holdouts, the hostage-taking that bent Iceland and Greenland and the Faroe Islands toward Christ, sit alongside the religion of love and mercy in whose name they were committed. This is the story of Olaf Tryggvason. And to tell it properly, we have to begin not with his birth, but with the world that made his birth possible. A world where slavery was ordinary, where violence was governance, where gods demanded blood, and where a 3-year-old boy could be stolen from his mother and sold in a foreign market and somehow, impossibly, survive to become a king. The sources for what follows are limited, partisan, and occasionally fantastic. This is the nature of Viking Age history. We have no documents from Olaf's own hand. We have no court records, no tax rolls, no bureaucratic archives of the kind that survive from Carolingian Francia or Byzantine Constantinople. What we have are the sagas, written down 2 to 3 centuries after the events they describe by Christian monks in Iceland who had their own theological reasons for telling certain stories in certain ways. The primary sources are these: Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, composed around 1230, which presents Olaf's life as a series of dramatic set pieces arranged for maximum narrative effect. The saga of Olaf Tryggvason, found in the Flati Jarbok, a 14th century compilation that preserves older material but also elaborates freely. Adam of Bremen's Gesta Hammaburgensis Ecclesiae Pontificum, written around 1075, which offers a near-contemporary but geographically distant German perspective on Scandinavian affairs. And scattered mentions in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in Russian chronicles, in Icelandic annals. The problems are obvious. Snorri wrote more than 2 centuries after Olaf's death, working from oral traditions that had already passed through generations of retelling. He was a politician as much as a historian, a man involved in the violent factional struggles of 13th century Iceland, and his portraits of Norwegian kings served contemporary purposes. Adam of Bremen never visited Norway and relied on informants whose reliability varied. The Russian sources are fragmentary and often contradictory. Modern scholarship, archaeological, linguistic, comparative, has done what it can to triangulate. We can carbon date the timber in churches Olaf is said to have built. We can trace coin distributions and trade routes. We can compare the saga accounts to documentary evidence from the courts of England and Byzantium. The result is not certainty, but something approaching a defensible skeleton, a chronology, a set of events that probably happened in roughly the order described, and a set of events that probably didn't happen at all, but tell us something about how Olaf was remembered. What we cannot recover is the inner life. We cannot know what Olaf thought as he watched his mother sold. We cannot know whether his conversion to Christianity was genuine belief or calculated politics, or some irreducible combination. We cannot know whether he felt doubt as he ordered the blinding of pagan priests. The sources give us action, they give us speech, they occasionally give us reported emotion. But they do not give us access to the consciousness that experienced these things. This is the nature of the project. We are reconstructing a life from fragments, aware that the fragments were shaped by later hands, reaching toward a man who was real in ways we can document and mythologized in ways we must acknowledge. What follows is as true as it can be made. Where certainty fails, I will say so. To understand Olaf Tryggvason, you must first understand the Norway he was born into. And the Norway he was born into was not, in any modern sense, a country. The geography alone made unity nearly impossible. Norway is a vertical kingdom, stretched along the western edge of the Scandinavian peninsula like a ribbon caught on a nail. From the southern farmlands around the Oslofjord to the Arctic reaches of Hålogaland is roughly the same distance as from Rome to Edinburgh. But the distance is the least of the problem. Between north and south lie the mountains, the Scandinavian range, old and rounded but still impassable for most of the year, splitting the country into dozens of isolated valleys, each facing its own fjord, each looking outward toward the sea rather than inward toward its neighbors. The sea, in fact, was the country. If you wanted to travel from Trondheim to Bergen, a journey of perhaps 200 miles as the crow flies, you did not walk. You could not walk. The terrain would kill you. You took a ship, following the coast, and the journey that would take weeks on foot took days by water. The fjords were highways, the mountains were walls, and the result was a country that functioned less like a unified state than like an archipelago of maritime chiefdoms, each powerful enough to dominate its local waters, none powerful enough to impose lasting control over the others. In the middle of the 9th century, Roughly 100 years before Olaf's birth, a king named Harald Fairhair had managed, for a single generation, to impose something like hegemony over the western Norwegian coast. The Battle of Hafrsfjord, fought around 872, had made him the dominant warlord in the south, but Harald's kingdom died with Harald's heirs. His descendants, like the descendants of Charlemagne, spent more time killing each other than governing. By the time Olaf was born, around 968, the old hierarchy had fragmented again. Denmark had extended its influence over the southern districts. The Jarls of Hladir, the most powerful family in the Trondheim region, had established what amounted to an independent state in the north, ruling under nominal Danish overlordship, but functionally autonomous. And the western coast, the maritime heartland that had produced the Viking expansion, was a patchwork of competing interests, held together by nothing more durable than marriage and threat. Into this landscape, Olaf Tryggvason was born, and the circumstances of his birth were designed almost perfectly to get him killed. His father was Tryggvi Olafsson, a minor king who ruled a small district in the southeast around the Oslofjord. Tryggvi claimed descent from Harald Fairhair, which meant he had a theoretical claim to greater kingship, which meant he was a threat to anyone currently holding power. His mother was Astrid Eiriksdottir, daughter of a wealthy landowner from Uppland. The marriage was strategic, as all such marriages were. The love was beside the point. What mattered was the alliance, the network, the consolidation of enough swords and ships to survive another season. It didn't work. When Olaf was somewhere between 1 and 3 years old, the sources disagree, Tryggvi was killed. The circumstances vary by telling. Some accounts blame the sons of Eric Bloodaxe, Harald Fairhair's grandson, who were at that point attempting to reclaim Norway for their line. Others suggest it was the doing of the Danish king Harald Bluetooth, who was working to extend Danish control over the Oslo region. The mechanism doesn't matter. What matters is this: Olaf's father was dead, and his mother was alone with an infant whose bloodline made him valuable to kidnappers and dangerous to kings. Astrid ran. The flight from Norway is one of the most vivid episodes in the saga tradition, and while the details are certainly embellished, the core is plausible. A widow with a royal child, fleeing through a country where every chieftain was either an enemy or a potential betrayer, would have to move constantly, trust no one, and ultimately leave Scandinavia entirely. According to the sagas, Astrid took Olaf east, across Sweden toward the Russes' lands around Lake Ladoga, where her brother Sigurd was said to serve in the retinue of Prince Vladimir in Novgorod. She didn't make it. Somewhere in the Baltic, the sagas place it near Estonia, among the islands off the eastern shore, her ship was intercepted by raiders. Vikings, ironically, though the term obscures more than it clarifies. These were Baltic raiders, men who operated the same way Norse raiders did, preying on the same sea lanes that Norse ships had pioneered. They took the ship, they took the passengers, and they sold them. Olaf Tryggvason, great-great-grandson of Harald Fairhair, heir to whatever remained of his father's pretensions, was purchased by a man named Clercon for the price of a good cloak. Slavery in the early medieval Baltic was not what modern readers might imagine. It was not the racialized chattel slavery of the Atlantic system, which would not emerge for another 5 centuries. It was not even the plantation slavery of the Roman latifundia. It was something older, more varied, and in some ways more porous, a system in which the enslaved were property but not always permanently, in which a slave might be worked to death or might be adopted into a household, in which the distinction between thrall and servant could blur depending on circumstance and luck. The sources do not tell us what young Olaf's life was like in Estonia. They do not tell us whether he was beaten, whether he was hungry, whether he understood what had happened to him. They give us only the fact of his servitude and the eventual fact of his liberation. The gap is 6 years. From roughly age 3 to age 9, the future king of Norway was a slave in a foreign land, and we know almost nothing about it. What we can infer is this: he survived. Survival for a child slave in the Baltic littoral was not guaranteed. The work was hard, the climate was harsh. Disease took whom it pleased. A child without protectors, without family, without even the language of those around him, was especially vulnerable. That Olaf lived through 6 years of this suggests either unusual resilience, unusual luck, or some circumstance the sources do not preserve. A kindly owner, a position in a household rather than a field, something that kept him alive when he might easily have died. And then his uncle found him. The story, as the sagas tell it, has the quality of fairy tale. Sigurd Eiriksson, Astrid's brother, was a wealthy man in the service of Prince Vladimir of Novgorod. He was traveling through Estonia on some business. Tax collection, the sagas suggest, though the nature of the levy is unclear, when he passed through a market. There, he saw a boy. The boy's face was familiar. Sigurd asked questions. The boy answered in a language Sigurd recognized, and Sigurd, realizing what he had found, purchased his nephew on the spot. The details are suspiciously neat. The coincidence is extreme. But stranger things have happened, and the outcome is not in serious historical doubt. By the time Olaf was 9 or 10 years old, he was living in Novgorod, in the household of a Rus's prince, no longer a slave but not yet a king. The Novgorod that Olaf entered in the late 970s was one of the most remarkable places in the medieval world. And to understand why, you have to understand what the Ruses actually were. The conventional story, the story that appears in the Russian primary chronicle and has shaped popular imagination ever since, is that the Rus were Vikings. Specifically, they were Swedes who had crossed the Baltic in the 9th century, established trading posts along the river routes between the Baltic and the Black Sea, and gradually become the ruling elite of the Slavic peoples they encountered. The very name Russia derives from them, from Rus, which may in turn derive from an Old Norse word for rowing or for the Swedish coastal region of Roslagen. The reality, as usual, is more complicated. The Rus of Olaf's era were certainly Scandinavian in origin, but by the 970s they had been intermarrying with Slavic populations for a century. They spoke Old Norse, but also Slavic languages. They worshipped Odin and Thor, but also Perun and Veles. They were, in anthropological terms, a creolized elite, Norse enough to maintain connections with Scandinavia, Slavic enough to govern Slavic populations, and Byzantine enough, through trade and treaty, to aspire to the cultural prestige of Constantinople. Novgorod itself sat at the northern end of the great river highway that connected the Baltic to the Byzantine world. Goods flowed south, amber, furs, wax, slaves. Goods flowed north, silk, silver, spices, the manufactured luxuries of an empire that still called itself Roman. The city was wealthy, cosmopolitan, and violent, a place where fortunes were made and throats were cut with roughly equal frequency. The princes who ruled it did so by maintaining the loyalty of their armed retinues, by collecting tribute from the Slavic tribes, and by keeping the trade routes open. Vladimir, the prince whom Sigurd served and to whom he brought his nephew, was in the process of becoming one of the most significant figures in Russian history. In the 970s, he was still consolidating power, fighting his brothers for control of the scattered Russia's principalities, and he was still pagan. The Orthodox Christianity for which he would later become famous, canonized as Saint Vladimir, equal to the apostles, lay in the future. The Vladimir of Olaf's childhood was a warlord, a polygamist, a worshipper of the old gods, and apparently a man who appreciated talented young men regardless of their origins. Olaf, according to the sagas, thrived. The details are again sparse, but the trajectory is clear. The boy who had been a slave in Estonia became a retainer in the prince's household. He learned to fight. He learned to sail. He learned the complex political calculations of a multi-ethnic court where Scandinavian warriors served Slavic princes in pursuit of Byzantine gold. By his late teens, he was leading raids, or at least participating in them, acquiring the reputation for physical courage and tactical acumen that would later serve him in Norway. The chronology here is murky. The sagas want to get Olaf to his kingship as quickly as possible, so they compress the Novgorod years. Modern scholars have tried to reconstruct a plausible timeline: born around 968, enslaved around 970, 971, ransomed around 977, 978, active in Vladimir's service through the early 980s. The numbers are approximate, but somewhere in this period, the sources place it vaguely in his early 20s, Olaf left the Rus's lands and went west. Why he left is unclear. The sagas offer various explanations: a romantic entanglement with Vladimir's wife, a prophecy from a Christian hermit, simple wanderlust. What matters is that he went, and where he went was the Baltic and the North Sea, and what he did there was raid. To call what Olaf did in the 980s and early 990s raiding is technically accurate, but aesthetically misleading. The word conjures images of smash-and-grab operations, of small boats appearing suddenly and disappearing quickly. What Olaf led was something larger, a sustained campaign of maritime warfare that ranged from the Baltic to the English Channel, that extracted tribute from populations who could not resist, and that established him as one of the most formidable naval commanders in Northern Europe. The first targets were probably the Baltic coasts. The same shores where Olaf had been enslaved as a child now paid tribute to his ships. This was not revenge in any personal sense. The men who had bought and sold him were long dead or irrelevant, but it was a kind of poetic closure that the saga writers certainly appreciated. From the Baltic, he moved west. The sagas place him in Frisia, in Flanders, in the British Isles. He appears in English sources as one of the leaders of the great Viking armies that extorted silver from Anglo-Saxon kings in the 990s. The English evidence is important because it is contemporary. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, while not as detailed as historians might wish, records the presence of Scandinavian fleets raiding the English coast in 991-994 and subsequent years. The Danegeld, the tribute paid to buy off Viking armies, was assessed at staggering levels: 10,000 pounds of silver in 991, 16,000 in 994, and eventually much more. Olaf is named as one of the leaders of the 994 expedition, alongside the Danish king Svein Forkbeard, who would later become his enemy. But the entry that matters most comes from 994. The chronicle records that Olaf came to terms with King Ethelred the Unready, as later generations would call him, though the nickname is a pun on his name, meaning ill-counseled rather than unprepared. Olaf accepted a payment of 16,000 pounds of silver, and then something remarkable happened. He was baptized. The baptism took place at Andover. King Ethelred himself stood as Olaf's sponsor, his godfather in the ritual sense. It was a political ceremony as much as a religious one, a way of binding a dangerous enemy through spiritual kinship, of making treaty breaking not just illegal, but sacrilegious. But the sources suggest it was also something more. Olaf, they claim, had already encountered Christianity in his years of wandering. He had met a hermit in the Scilly Islands off Cornwall who had prophesied his future. He had seen the wealth and power of Christian kingdoms, and somewhere in this accumulation of experience, he had come to believe, or at least to act as if he believed, that the Christian God was the God for kings who wished to build states. After the baptism, Olaf kept his word. He never again raided England. This was unusual. Viking promises to Christian kings were not historically reliable. That Olaf honored this one suggests the conversion was not purely cynical. Something had changed. And now, in his late 20s, wealthy from a decade of successful raiding, commanding a fleet and a reputation, newly baptized and newly serious about what that meant, Olaf Tryggvason turned his attention to Norway. The Norway he turned toward was ruled by Jarl Håkon of Hladir, and Jarl Håkon was everything Olaf was not. Håkon was old. He had been the dominant figure in Norwegian politics for nearly 30 years. He ruled the Trondheim region directly and exercised varying degrees of influence over the rest of the coast. His relationship with the Danish crown was complex. He had submitted to Danish overlordship when necessary and defied it when possible. But he was functionally the ruler of Norway in all but name. He was also the last great champion of the old gods. This was not incidental. Håkon's paganism was central to his rule. He maintained the great temple at Hladir. He made sacrifices to Odin and Freyr and the other gods. He resisted the Christian missionaries who had begun to appear in Scandinavia, sent from Hamburg Bremen by German bishops eager to expand the boundaries of Christendom. For Håkon, the old religion was not simply tradition, it was legitimacy. The gods had given him victory. The gods sustained his power. To abandon them would be to abandon everything that made him strong. By 995, Hakon's strength was failing. The sources describe a jarl who had grown cruel and arbitrary, whose exactions had turned the farmers against him, whose treatment of women, he was said to have seized farmers' wives for his pleasure, had created enemies even among those who had no political grievances. Whether this picture is accurate or is simply the propaganda of the winners is impossible to know. What is clear is that when Olaf appeared with his fleet on the Norwegian coast, Hakon could not hold. The collapse was faster than anyone expected. Olaf landed in Trondheim. Farmers flocked to him, partly because he was a descendant of Harald Fairhair, partly because he was not Hakon, partly because his ships and his silver suggested he could protect those who followed him. Hakon fled. He was betrayed by one of his own servants, a man named Kark, who killed the jarl while he hid in a pigsty and brought the head to Olaf expecting a reward. Olaf had Kark executed. The message was clear. Loyalty mattered, even loyalty to enemies. And so, in 995 or 996, the sources give different years, Olaf Tryggvason became king of Norway. He was somewhere between 26 and 28 years old. He had been a slave, a retainer, a raider, and now he was a king. The question was what kind of king he would be. The answer became clear almost immediately. Olaf had come to Norway not simply to rule, but to transform. He had accepted baptism in England, he had made promises to the god of that baptism, and he intended to deliver the entire Norwegian people to that god, whether they wished to be delivered or not. The methods he used would become legend, and the legends were not exaggerations. In the Trondheim region, which had been the heartland of Jarl Hakon's pagan rule, Olaf began by destroying the temples. The great hall at Hladir, where Hakon had made his sacrifices, was torn down. The idols were smashed, the sacred groves were cut down and burned. In their place, Olaf built churches, wooden structures at first raised in weeks rather than years, staffed by priests he had brought from England or recruited from the small Christian communities that already existed on the Norwegian coast. The destruction of temples was dramatic, but in itself not unprecedented. Christian rulers throughout Europe had been demolishing pagan shrines for centuries. What made Olaf distinctive was his treatment of the people who refused to accept the new faith. The sagas describe what happened next in terms that later Christian hagiographers would find uncomfortable. Olaf did not simply offer baptism. He did not simply build churches and wait for conversion to follow. He made paganism a crime punishable by death, mutilation, and dispossession, and he enforced those punishments with a consistency that left no doubt about his seriousness. In the Trondheim fjords, where resistance was strongest, Olaf summoned the local chieftains to assemblies and presented them with a choice that was not a choice: accept baptism or face consequences. The consequences varied. Some men were killed outright, others were blinded, others had their tongues cut out, a punishment that carried particular symbolic weight, since the tongue was the instrument of oath-making, of legal speech, of the invocations that called upon the old gods. A man without a tongue could not swear by Odin. He could not speak the names of the gods he had worshipped. He could only listen as the new prayers were said over him. The mutilations were not random. They were targeted at the men who held religious authority under the old system, the Godar, the chieftains who combined political and priestly functions, who maintained the local temples and conducted the sacrifices. These men were the infrastructure of Norwegian paganism. Remove them and the system would collapse. Olaf understood this with the clarity of someone who had spent years watching how power actually worked. He also understood the power of spectacle. At Mer, one of the most important cult sites in Trøndelag, Olaf gathered the farmers for what they thought would be a negotiation. Inside the temple stood the images of Thor and the other gods, decorated with gold and silver, surrounded by the accumulated offerings of generations. Olaf entered the temple with his men. He carried an axe, and while the farmers watched, some of them armed, all of them uncertain, he struck the image of Thor with the axe and sent it crashing to the floor. His men destroyed the other idols. The gold and silver were stripped away. The temple was burned. The farmers did not resist. This is the detail that the sagas emphasize, though they do not quite explain it. Armed men on their own ground, watching their gods desecrated, and they did not fight. Perhaps they were outnumbered. Perhaps they calculated that resistance would mean death for them and enslavement for their families. Perhaps some of them had already begun to doubt the gods who had allowed Jarl Håkon to fall so easily. The sources do not say. What they say is that the farmers accepted baptism. They accepted it in large numbers across the Trondheim region and then across the rest of Norway as Olaf's campaign expanded. The speed of the conversion is one of the striking features of Olaf's reign. Within 3 years, he had imposed at least nominal Christianity on most of the Norwegian coast. The inland regions remained more resistant, harder to reach, less susceptible to the kind of naval power that Olaf wielded. But the coastal population, the population that mattered for trade, for military levies, for political control, was baptized. Churches were built, priests were installed, the old temples were gone. This raises a question that the sources do not answer directly, but that hovers over the entire narrative. What did Olaf actually believe? The saga writers, composing their accounts 2 or 3 centuries after the events, had no doubt. Olaf was a Christian king doing Christian work. His violence was the violence of a saint, regrettable perhaps, but justified by its results. Later generations would canonize him in popular memory, though never officially. He became one of the founding figures of Norwegian Christianity, remembered alongside Olaf Haraldsson, who would complete his work a generation later. But the contemporary evidence is less clear. The methods Olaf used, the mutilations, the killings, the destruction of sacred sites, were not unique to him. They were standard practice for early medieval rulers imposing religious conformity. Charlemagne had done the same thing to the Saxons 2 centuries earlier. The Byzantine emperors had done it to pagans within their own territory. The question is not whether the methods were Christian, by the standards of the time they were, but whether Olaf's motives were primarily religious or primarily political. The distinction may be false. In the early medieval world, religion and politics were not separate categories. A king's legitimacy came from his relationship with divine power. Olaf had been baptized by English bishops, had received confirmation from an archbishop, had made himself part of the Christian network of European kings. His conversion of Norway was not simply an imposition of belief, it was an assertion of his membership in a particular international order. The kings of Denmark were Christian. The kings of Sweden were moving toward Christianity. The Holy Roman Emperor was Christian. To rule Norway as a pagan would have meant isolation, vulnerability, exclusion from the alliances and the trade relationships that sustained medieval states. At the same time, we should not dismiss the possibility of genuine conviction. Olaf had been enslaved as a child. He had been ransomed, raised in exile, buffeted by forces he could not control. At some point in his life, he had encountered a religion that promised meaning, order, and the protection of a god more powerful than any local deity. The appeal is not hard to imagine. Whether that appeal persisted through the blood and the burning is another question. What we can say is that Olaf pursued conversion with an intensity that exceeded political calculation. He did not simply require outward conformity, the minimum necessary for political integration. He hunted down resistors. He destroyed sacred objects that could have been left alone without affecting his power. He took personal risks to confront pagan holdouts when delegation would have been safer. The sources describe a man possessed by a mission, not a cynic going through motions. The mission extended beyond Norway's borders. By 997 or 998, Olaf had established control over most of the Norwegian coast. The next targets were the islands and territories that had been settled by Norwegians over the previous century. The Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, the Orkneys, the Shetlands. These were not part of Norway in any formal sense. They were independent communities, some of them with their own local assemblies, their own chieftains, their own laws. But they were linked to Norway by blood, by language, by trade, and by the constant movement of ships across the North Atlantic. Olaf's ambition was to bring them all to Christianity, and he was willing to use hostage-taking to do it. The case of Iceland is the best documented. By the late 990s, Iceland had been settled for just over a century. It had no king, no central authority. Power was distributed among the Godar, the chieftain priests who controlled the local assemblies and the cult sites. The Althing, the annual General Assembly at Thingvellir, was the closest thing to a national institution, a place where disputes were settled, laws were proclaimed, and the leading men of the island negotiated with one another. Christianity had made inroads. There were Christians on the island, some of them influential, but the majority remained pagan. Olaf's approach was simple. Icelanders traveled to Norway for trade, for service in noble households, for the kind of opportunity that their own small island could not provide. When they arrived, Olaf seized them. Not all of them, that would have been impractical, but enough of them, particularly the sons and relatives of important chieftains. He held them hostage, and he sent a message back to Iceland: convert, or your kinsmen die. The message arrived in Iceland in the year 999 or 1000. The sources are ambiguous about the exact date, and it coincided with rising tensions between the Christian and pagan factions on the island. The Althing that summer faced a crisis. Two legal systems could not coexist. Two sets of gods could not share the same assembly. Something had to give. What happened next is one of the most remarkable episodes in medieval Scandinavian history. The pagan chieftains and the Christian chieftains agreed to submit the question to a single arbitrator. Thorgeir Ljósvetninga Godi, a pagan Godi known for his wisdom and his fairness. Thorgeir retreated under his cloak, literally covered himself, and lay silent for a day and a night, thinking. When he emerged, he announced his decision. Iceland would become Christian. All Icelanders would be baptized. The public worship of the old gods would end. But Thorgeir added provisions that revealed the pragmatism of the arrangement. Private worship of the old gods would be tolerated. The eating of horse meat, a pagan practice connected to sacrificial ritual, would continue. The exposure of infants, another practice condemned by the church, would remain legal. These were compromises, pressure valves that allowed the transition to occur without immediate civil war. The Icelanders accepted the decision. Within weeks, the chieftains who had come to the Althing were baptized in the nearest available water, the hot springs at Thingvellir, according to some accounts. Christianity became the official religion of Iceland. Olaf's hostages were released. The Icelandic conversion is often presented as a peaceful, rational affair, the cool-headed decision of a pragmatic people weighing their options. And in comparison to what had happened in Norway, it was no mutilations, no burnings, no mass executions. But the threat that had produced the decision was Olaf's threat. The hostages were Olaf's hostages. The Icelanders converted because the alternative, watching their kinsmen die in a foreign land, facing Norwegian naval power with no fleet of their own, was unacceptable. The rationality of the decision does not negate the coercion that shaped it. Greenland followed, though the evidence is thinner. Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, was in Norway around 999. The sagas say that Olaf commissioned him to bring Christianity to Greenland, to carry priests and the message of Christ across the Atlantic to the small Norse settlement on the western edge of the known world. Leif accepted the mission. Whether he accepted it willingly or under the same pressure that had moved the Icelanders is not clear. He returned to Greenland, converted his mother, and established a church at Brattahlid that archaeological excavations have since uncovered. Eric the Red himself reportedly refused baptism, and his wife reportedly refused to share his bed after her conversion, a small domestic drama that the sagas record without comment. The Faroes were converted. The Orkneys and Shetlands, already under strong Norwegian influence, were brought more firmly into the Christian fold. By the end of his reign, which would last only 5 years, Olaf Tryggvason had imposed Christianity in some form on virtually every Norse community in the North Atlantic. The scale of this achievement is easy to understate. These were not people who had been waiting for a new religion. Many of them were deeply attached to the gods of their ancestors, the gods who had been worshipped since before memory. The rites of the old religion were woven into the agricultural year, into the rhythms of birth and death, into the oaths that bound men to their lords and their kin. To abandon them was not simply to change beliefs, it was to change everything. And yet, they abandoned them, not all of them, not willingly. not without resistance that the sources only partially record. But within a single decade, the religious landscape of the Norse world had been transformed. The temples were gone, the idols were gone, the sacrifices had stopped. In their place stood wooden churches, priests who spoke a foreign liturgical language, and a god who demanded exclusive allegiance. The transformation was incomplete. Beneath the surface of official Christianity, older practices persisted for generations. Amulets worn under Christian clothes, offerings left at sacred stones, beliefs about elves and land spirits that the church could condemn but not eradicate. The conversion of Scandinavia was a process, not an event, and it would not be truly finished for centuries. But Olaf Tryggvason had begun it. He had paid for it in blood, his enemy's blood, and soon enough, his own. By 999, Olaf was at the height of his power. He controlled Norway. He had extended his religious influence across the North Atlantic. He had built a fleet that was the envy of Scandinavia. His flagship, the Long Serpent, was said to be the largest warship ever constructed in Norway. Tradition says it measured over 160 feet from stem to stern, with 34 rowing benches per side and a gilded dragon's head at its prow that caught the light as it moved through the water. Whether the dimensions are exact is less important than what they represented. Olaf had the resources to build on a scale that no Norwegian king before him had matched. He also had enemies. The enemies had been accumulating throughout his reign. Svein Forkbeard, king of Denmark, had not forgotten the raids Olaf had conducted as a young man, raids that had struck Danish territories alongside English ones. More importantly, Svein resented Norwegian independence. Denmark and Norway had been linked by shifting alliances and hostilities for generations, and from Svein's perspective, a strong Norwegian king was a threat. Olaf II, king of Sweden, sometimes called Olaf Skotkonung, though the sources use various names, had his own grievances and his own ambitions. And Erik Håkonsson, the son of Jarl Håkon, the man Olaf had displaced, wanted revenge. He had fled to Sweden after his father's death. He had married into the Swedish royal family. He had spent years nursing his hatred. These three, the king of Denmark, the king of Sweden, and the dispossessed Norwegian Jarl, formed an alliance. The specific terms are lost, but the goal was clear: destroy Olaf Tryggvason and divide his kingdom among themselves. The opportunity came in the year 1000. Olaf was returning from an expedition to the southern Baltic. Some sources say he had gone to collect his new wife. Others say he was pursuing a political alliance with a Slavic prince. The details are murky. What is clear is that he was sailing north with a small fleet, perhaps 11 ships, when he entered the strait near the island of Svolder. The location of Svolder has been debated for 1,000 years. Some scholars place it in the Øresund, the narrow passage between Denmark and Sweden. Others put it near the island of Rügen, off the coast of what is now Germany. The saga accounts are inconsistent, and the geography they describe does not map cleanly onto any single location. What matters is the tactical situation: a narrow body of water, limited room to maneuver, and an enemy fleet waiting in concealment. Olaf did not know the fleet was there. His scouts had failed, or had been bought, or had simply not looked carefully enough. When his ships entered the strait, they found themselves facing a combined force that outnumbered them by a factor of at least 5 to 1. Some accounts say 70 ships against 11, others say more. The Battle of Svolder began on a late summer morning. The sea was calm, the air was still. Olaf ordered his ships lashed together, forming a floating platform from which his men could fight as infantry while their enemies tried to board. The Long Serpent was at the center, its size making it the obvious target and the obvious anchor. The Allied fleet attacked in waves. The smaller Norwegian ships were overwhelmed first, boarded, cleared, their crews killed or driven into the water. One by one, Olaf's flanking vessels were taken. The defensive line contracted. Men died. The deck of the Long Serpent grew slick. What happened in the final hours of the battle has become legendary, and legends are not reliable history. The sagas describe Olaf fighting with a sword in each hand. They describe him throwing spears with impossible accuracy. They describe the Allied kings watching from a distance, sending wave after wave of men to their deaths against the Long Serpent's defenders. Eric Håkansson finally led the assault himself, bringing his ship alongside the Long Serpent and pouring his best warriors onto its deck. The end came around noon, or so the reconstructions suggest. Most of Olaf's men were dead. The survivors were overwhelmed, the ship was taken, and Olaf Tryggvason leapt over the side. He was wearing full armor. He held his shield above his head. The water was cold. The North Atlantic in September is always cold and deep. He went down. His body was never found. The Danish and Swedish warriors searched the water. They questioned survivors. They waited for a corpse to wash ashore. Nothing, no body, no armor, no sword, just the empty water and the blood dispersing in the current. The absence of a body created space for legend. Within years, stories circulated that Olaf had survived, that he had slipped beneath his shield and swum to safety, that he had been rescued by a passing ship, that he had traveled to the Holy Land and died as a pilgrim, that he was living in a monastery somewhere, waiting for the moment to return. None of these stories have any evidence behind them. The most likely explanation is the simplest. Olaf drowned. His armor dragged him down. The sea took him. But the sea taking him was not the same as the sea returning him. In death, Olaf became something he had never quite been in life. A mystery. The mystery proved more durable than the man. In the immediate aftermath of Svolder, the victors divided Norway like a carcass. Eric Håkansson, who had led the final assault on the Long Serpent, received the largest portion. The coastal territories his father had once ruled, now restored to pagan-leaning jarls who owed their power to foreign kings. Svein Forkbeard of Denmark claimed the southwestern regions and the tribute rights that came with them. Olaf Skotkonung of Sweden took a smaller share, a wedge of territory that gave him influence over the eastern approaches. The kingdom Olaf had spent 5 years building was dismantled in a matter of weeks. His churches did not burn, not immediately, but the pressure behind them evaporated. The bishops he had installed found themselves without a protector. The chieftains who had accepted baptism at sword point discovered that the sword was gone. What followed was not a clean reversion to paganism. That would have been too simple, too symmetrical. Instead, Norway entered a period of religious ambiguity that would last for nearly 3 decades. Some communities kept their churches, others let them rot. Some families continued to baptize their children, others quietly resumed the old sacrifices, the blots to Odin and Thor that Olaf had tried so violently to suppress. The country existed in a liminal space, neither fully Christian nor fully pagan, the outcome of Olaf's campaign suspended rather than resolved. This suspension is historically important and often overlooked. The standard narrative of Scandinavian Christianization presents it as a one-way process. Kings convert, populations follow, the old gods fade. But the decades after Svolder complicate that story. They suggest that forced conversion, however brutal, does not automatically produce lasting faith. The violence Olaf inflicted on Håkon of Lade, on the sidemen of Trondheim, on the farmers who refused to eat the consecrated horse meat, that violence created compliance, not belief. When the source of the violence disappeared beneath the waves at Svolder, the compliance became optional. Eric Håkansson was not a zealous pagan. He was, by most accounts, a practical man who had been baptized himself during a visit to England. But he understood that his power base lay among the old aristocratic families who had resisted Olaf's religious centralization. He did not actively persecute Christians. He simply stopped forcing anyone to be one. The distinction mattered. In the absence of coercion, the Norwegian population made its own choices. Some chose Christ. Many chose to wait and see which god proved stronger. The news of Svolder traveled slowly, as all news did in the year 1000. It reached Iceland sometime in the autumn, probably via merchant ships returning from Norwegian trading posts. The reaction was muted. Iceland had accepted Christianity only months earlier, at the Althing of that same summer, and the conversion had been a negotiated settlement rather than a military conquest. The Icelanders had reasons of their own for abandoning the old gods, chief among them the desire to maintain trade relations with an increasingly Christian Europe. Olaf's death did not change those calculations. The Icelandic church, fragile as it was, survived. Greenland was different. The colony was smaller, more isolated, more dependent on Norway for contact with the wider world. Leif Erikson had brought Christianity to the settlement at his mother's urging. Theodild, who had built that small church at Brattahlid and refused to share a bed with her pagan husband. But the Greenlandic church was barely established when Olaf died. Without a Christianizing king in Norway to reinforce the faith, without regular contact with European ecclesiastical structures, the settlers faced a choice. They chose mostly to remain Christian. The reasons are unclear. Perhaps Theodild's influence persisted. Perhaps the isolation itself made the settlers cling more tightly to the one connection with European civilization that Christianity represented. Perhaps they simply lacked the numbers and the social infrastructure to sustain the old religion's elaborate ritual calendar. Whatever the cause, Greenland stayed Christian while Norway wavered. The Faroe Islands fell somewhere between. The forced baptisms Olaf had demanded had taken place under duress, and the priests he had sent were few and poorly supported. When word came that Olaf was dead, that his fleet had been destroyed, that his body had vanished, some Faroes communities quietly set aside the new religion. Others kept it. The islands entered the same ambiguous space as Norway itself, waiting for the next strong king to tell them which god to worship. This is the pattern that Olaf's career established, whether he intended it or not. Conversion in early medieval Scandinavia was not primarily about spiritual transformation, it was about power. A king strong enough to force baptisms could make his subjects Christian. A king too weak to enforce his will could not. The religion followed the sword, and when the sword fell silent, the religion's hold loosened. This does not mean that no Scandinavians genuinely believed. Some surely did. The skalds who composed poems about the White Christ, the women who named their children after saints, the men who requested burial in consecrated ground. These were not all cynics performing faith for political advantage. But the institutional church, the network of parishes and priests and bishops that would eventually make Scandinavia permanently Christian, required continuous royal support. Olaf provided that support for 5 years. His death removed it. The long serpent did not sink at Svolder. Eric Håkansson captured it intact, or nearly intact, its deck scarred by combat, its crew dead or fled, but its hull still sound. He kept it as a trophy, a physical reminder of his victory over the king who had built it. The ship appears in the sources for several more years, serving in Eric's fleet, a ghost of Olaf's ambition sailing under a different banner. Eventually, it disappears from the records. Ships do not last forever, not even legendary ones. The Long Serpent rotted or was broken up for timber or sank in some unrecorded storm. Its fate is unknown. Like Olaf's body, it simply ceased to exist in the documentary record, leaving behind only the memory of what it had been. The absence haunted Norway. Kings do not simply vanish. Their bodies are displayed, buried, mourned, commemorated. The rituals of royal death serve political functions. They demonstrate that power has passed, that the old order is truly ended, that the new ruler stands unchallenged. Olaf's disappearance denied his enemies that closure. For years after Svolder, rumors circulated. He was alive in a monastery in Jerusalem. He was alive in a hermitage in Syria. He had been picked up by a Wendish ship and was living among the Slavs, planning his return. None of these stories were true. All of them were believed by someone. The psychological power of the missing king is not unique to Olaf. History offers parallels. Frederick Barbarossa, sleeping beneath a mountain until Germany needs him. King Sebastian of Portugal, who died in Morocco in 1578, but whose return was anticipated for centuries. Arthur, waiting in Avalon. The pattern suggests something about how human communities process the loss of charismatic leaders. A confirmed death is final. A disappearance is not. The absent king becomes a vessel for hope, for fear, for unfulfilled expectation. Olaf's leap into the water at Svolder, shield raised, armor gleaming, the cold sea waiting below, became the founding image of a myth that would outlast any memory of his actual policies. We should pause to consider what those policies actually accomplished. Olaf ruled Norway for 5 years. In that time, he forced the conversion of the coastal regions, destroyed the major pagan cult sites, executed or exiled the leading practitioners of traditional religion, and established a network of churches staffed by foreign priests. He sent missionaries to Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands, using hostages and threats to compel the adoption of Christianity in societies over which he had no direct military control. He built the largest warship the Norse world had ever seen. He centralized royal authority to a degree unprecedented in Norwegian history. He made himself the most powerful king in Scandinavia. And then he lost everything in a single afternoon. The question that historians have debated for 1,000 years is whether Olaf's work survived his death. The answer depends on how you measure survival. If survival means continuous Christian practice from 1000 onward, then Olaf failed. Norway reverted to religious ambiguity for 30 years. The churches he built fell into disrepair. The priests he brought fled or died. The old gods received sacrifices again in at least some communities. But if survival means establishing the conditions that would eventually make Norway permanently Christian, then Olaf succeeded. The 30 years after his death were not a clean return to paganism. They were a period of competition, of choice, of gradual sorting. And when the next great Christianizing king arrived, Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, who claimed the throne in 1015, he found a country that had already been partially converted. The groundwork had been laid. The temples had been destroyed. The memory of what Olaf Tryggvason had done, however brutal, had demonstrated that Christianity and royal power could be linked, that a king could use the new religion to break the old aristocracy, that the church could serve the crown. Saint Olaf would complete the work. He would die at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, and his death, unlike Olaf Tryggvason's, would be witnessed, documented, commemorated. His body would be recovered, miracles would be attributed to his corpse. He would become Norway's eternal king, its patron saint, the symbol of Christian Norway for all time. The earlier Olaf, the slave child from Estonia who had fought his way to a throne and then vanished into the sea, would be overshadowed. Saint Olaf got the churches and the feast days. Olaf Tryggvason got the legends. There is an injustice in this, if injustice is the right word for the distribution of historical memory. Olaf Tryggvason was first. He was the one who broke the temples, killed the priests, forced the chieftains to kneel in baptismal water. He was the one who demonstrated that it could be done. Saint Olaf followed a path that his predecessor had already cleared with fire and sword. But history does not distribute credit fairly. It remembers what it chooses to remember. And Olaf Tryggvason, by dying the way he did, deprived posterity of the materials it needed to canonize him. There was no body to perform miracles, no tomb to become a pilgrimage site, no relics to work cures on the sick and the lame. The sea had taken him, and the sea does not return what it holds. The long serpent enters mythology at exactly this point, when the facts run out and the stories begin. The ship becomes, in saga literature, a symbol of doomed magnificence, the greatest vessel of its age destroyed by treachery and overwhelming force. The Battle of Svolder becomes, in the same literature, a tragedy of heroic resistance, Olaf and his men fighting to the last against impossible odds. The leap becomes, in the same literature, an act of defiance, the king choosing death over capture, choosing the cold, clean water over the humiliation of chains. None of this is necessarily false, but none of it is necessarily true either. The sagas were composed 2 centuries after the events they describe, by men who had access to oral traditions that had been shaped and reshaped by generations of retelling. The Olaf who emerges from those sagas is a literary character as much as a historical figure. He has been polished by poetry. His edges have been smoothed. His crimes have been reframed as the necessary harshness of a righteous king imposing a righteous faith. His death has been elevated from military defeat to martyrdom adjacent, the almost saint who died fighting for Christ against pagan treachery. The real Olaf, the man who actually lived, who made decisions under uncertainty, who bled and breathed and grew old enough to grow a beard, that man is almost entirely lost to us. We have the shape of his life. We have some of his actions. We have the consequences he produced. But the interior experience, the texture of what it felt like to be Olaf Tryggvason, is gone. It was probably gone within a generation of his death. Memory is not a recording device. It is a process of continuous reconstruction, and each reconstruction loses something while adding something else. The man becomes the myth, becomes the symbol, becomes the name in a book. What we can say is this: Olaf Tryggvason was sold into slavery at the age of 3. He survived, he escaped, he rose through the warrior hierarchies of the Rus and the Baltic and the North Sea until he became a king. He forced a religion onto a people who did not want it, using methods that would be recognized as atrocities by any modern standard. He built things that lasted: churches, ships, a pattern of royal authority. And he destroyed things that had lasted for centuries: temples, traditions, a way of understanding the world. He made enemies of every major king in Scandinavia. He sailed into an ambush with too few ships and too little information and too much confidence. He fought until fighting was no longer possible. And then he jumped. The water closed over him, the shield drifted, the armor pulled him down, and Norway, the country he had tried to remake in his own image, began the slow work of deciding what to do with his legacy. 30 years passed. The memory of Svolder faded from lived experience into oral tradition. The men who had fought in the battle grew old and died. Their sons heard the stories secondhand. Their grandsons heard them third-hand. Each retelling added details, removed others, shaped the narrative toward whatever moral the teller wished to emphasize. The Olaf of the sagas accumulated miracles, not official miracles, not church-sanctioned miracles, but folk miracles, stories of strange lights and prophetic dreams and last-minute rescues. The church never canonized him. The church had Saint Olaf for that, the later king with the documented death and the certified relics. But the people remembered Olaf Tryggvason anyway, in their own fashion, without ecclesiastical approval. The distinction matters. Official sanctity requires a body. It requires witnesses. It requires a process of verification, however corrupt or credulous that process might be. Olaf Tryggvason could not be made a saint because Olaf Tryggvason could not be found. His absence, which might have been the ultimate proof of divine favor, the assumption of the king into heaven, body and soul, was instead the ultimate barrier to institutional recognition. The church cannot canonize what it cannot examine. So Olaf became something else. He became a figure of popular legend, a hero rather than a saint, a character in stories rather than a presence in liturgy. The sagas gave him the afterlife that the church could not. They made him immortal in the only way that humans can be made immortal, by continuing to speak his name. Whether that immortality would have pleased him is impossible to know. He spent his reign trying to make Norway Christian. He killed for that goal. He tortured for it. He took hostages and burned men and blinded them and cut off their hands. He believed, or at least he acted as though he believed, that the salvation of his people's souls was worth any amount of present suffering. And yet, the Christianity he fought for ultimately forgot him. The church he served moved on to other heroes. The sea does not remember. The sea takes what it takes and keeps what it keeps and returns nothing but salt. Olaf went down into the water in the year 1000. The long serpent captured, sailed on without him. The world he had known, the world of raiding and trading and forced conversion, of dragon-proud ships and blood-stained altars, of jarls and kings and thralls, continued for another generation before beginning its slow transformation into something else. The Vikings became the Normans, the Rus, the Christian kings of Scandinavia. The Atlantic they had crossed became a highway for merchants and missionaries. The violence they had perfected became the violence of crusades and conquests conducted under different banners. None of them remembered the slave boy from Estonia. None of them knew that their world had been shaped in part by a child sold in a marketplace who had somehow clawed his way to a throne. History is long, memory is short. The gap between what happened and what is remembered widens with every passing year. But the stories persisted, the sagas were written, the name survived. Olaf Tryggvason, the king who leapt, the body that was never found. The water off Svolder is still there. It is cold in September. It has always been cold. The cold persists because the Baltic does not forget its temperatures. It remembers them in layers, the summer warmth floating briefly on the surface, the ancient winter cold waiting beneath, patient as stone. A body sinking through that water would pass through both layers in seconds. The armor would accelerate the descent, the lungs would empty, the pressure would build, and then stillness. The seafloor of Öresund is not deep, perhaps 20 meters in places, perhaps 30, but it is dark and it is silted and it does not surrender what it takes. The Danes searched. This is recorded, though the records are thin. Sweyn Forkbeard wanted proof. A king who might have survived was a king who might return, and Sweyn had seen enough of Olaf Tryggvason to know that the man had a talent for improbable resurrections, the slave boy who became a Rus warrior, the exile who became a king. A man like that, disappearing into water rather than dying on a deck, it left too much room for hope. So the Danes dragged the shallows. They sent swimmers down where swimmers could go. They questioned the survivors, the men pulled from the water, the men who had surrendered, the men who had fought for the losing side and now faced the particular humiliation of living when their king had not. No one had seen the body surface, no one had seen it drift. The shield, yes, that had floated briefly before waterlogging and sinking. The cloak perhaps, though the sources disagree. But the body of the king, the physical proof that Olaf Tryggvason was definitively dead, that remained at the bottom, or it did not exist, or it had somehow made its way to shore and vanished into the forests of whatever coastline the currents had chosen. The ambiguity was useful to no one and troubling to everyone. For Sweyn, it complicated the victory. He had won the battle absolutely. He had destroyed the Norwegian fleet, killed or captured the Norwegian king's closest companions, and established himself as the dominant power in Scandinavian waters. But a victory without a body is a victory without an ending, and Sweyn understood, as any medieval king understood, that endings mattered. The public display of a defeated enemy was not cruelty for its own sake. It was communication. It told the population that resistance was over, that the old order was finished, that the new order had arrived and would not be displaced. Without Olaf's corpse, that message remained incomplete. For the Norwegians, the ambiguity was worse. A king who might be dead is also a king who might not be, and a king who might not be dead is a rallying point for anyone dissatisfied with what comes next. The Jarls who had betrayed Olaf, and there were several, men who had made quiet arrangements with the Danes before Svolder, men who had held back their ships or failed to arrive at all, those Jarls now faced a peculiar problem. They had committed treason against a king who could not be proven dead. If Olaf somehow returned, from Russia, from England, from whatever Byzantine court might shelter a deposed Scandinavian monarch, those Jarls would face consequences that medieval politics made very specific. So the rumors started. They started because rumors always start, because people prefer uncertainty to finality, because a missing body is an invitation to narrative. Olaf had escaped. Olaf had been pulled from the water by loyal followers in a small boat. Olaf had swum to shore under cover of darkness, despite the armor, despite the wounds, despite the physical impossibility of the act. Olaf had been taken up by angels, or by the old gods, depending on who was telling the story, and carried to some other realm where he waited for the right moment to return. None of these stories were true. Almost certainly, none of them were true. The weight of the evidence, such as it is, points overwhelmingly to the obvious conclusion. Olaf Tryggvason drowned at Svolder on a September day in the year 1000, and his body settled into the silt of the Öresund, and the crabs did what crabs do, and within a few years there was nothing left to find, even if someone had known where to look. But certainty is not the same as proof, and proof is not the same as silence. The stories persisted because the stories served purposes. For those who had loved Olaf or feared him or simply preferred a dramatic narrative to a mundane one, the possibility of return was too compelling to abandon. For those who had betrayed him, the possibility of return was too terrifying to dismiss. And for the Church, the institution Olaf had served with such violent devotion, the ambiguity created a problem that would take decades to resolve. Consider the theological difficulty. Olaf Tryggvason had spent his reign converting Norway to Christianity. He had done this through methods that ranged from persuasion to torture, from gift-giving to hostage-taking, from the construction of churches to the destruction of temples. He had baptized thousands, killed hundreds, and transformed, or attempted to transform, a society that had worshipped the old gods for as long as anyone could remember. By any reasonable measure, he was one of the most important figures in the Christianization of Scandinavia. He should have been remembered as a saint. He was not. The reasons are multiple, and they illuminate the strange machinery of medieval sanctification. First, as already noted, there was no body. The process of canonization in the 11th century was not yet the elaborate bureaucratic procedure it would later become, but it still required something: relics, miracles, witnesses, documentation. A body provided all of these simultaneously. It could be examined for signs of sanctity, the incorrupt flesh, the sweet smell, the miraculous preservation that supposedly accompanied the remains of the holy. It could become the site of miracles as pilgrims touched it and reported healings. It could be divided, an arm here, a finger there, and distributed to churches that would pay handsomely for the privilege of housing a piece of the sacred. Without a body, none of this was possible. Olaf Tryggvason could not be a saint because Olaf Tryggvason could not be touched. Second, there was the matter of his methods. The Church of the 11th century was not squeamish about violence. It endorsed crusades. It authorized the execution of heretics. It understood, in ways that modern observers sometimes find difficult to credit, that the spread of Christianity had often involved the sword as much as the word. But there were limits, or at least there were appearances to maintain. Olaf's conversion campaigns had been brutal even by the standards of his time. The blindings, the burnings, the severed hands, these were known. They were remembered. They made it difficult to present Olaf as a model of Christian virtue, even to an audience that understood violence as a necessary tool. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there was another Olaf. Olaf Haraldsson, who would become Saint Olaf, who would become the patron saint of Norway, who would become the central figure of Norwegian Christian identity for centuries. That Olaf came later, ruled longer, died dramatically, and left a body. He was killed at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, 30 years after Svolder. His corpse was recovered. His corpse was examined. His corpse, according to the sources, showed signs of incorruption, the hair and nails continuing to grow, the flesh remaining soft and sweet-smelling, all the conventional markers of medieval sanctity. He was everything that the Church needed for a proper saint, and he arrived at exactly the right moment when Norway was ready to consolidate its Christian identity around a royal martyr. Olaf Tryggvason could not compete with that. He had come first, but he had disappeared. He had fought harder, but he had left no proof. He had baptized more people, perhaps, but he had also tortured more people, and the second fact made the first uncomfortable. So the Church made its choice. Saint Olaf became the saint. Olaf Tryggvason became the predecessor, the forerunner, the necessary but embarrassing first draft, the one who had done the difficult work of breaking the old religion so that his successor could build something new on the rubble. This is not how Olaf Tryggvason would have understood his own legacy. He thought he was building something permanent. He thought the churches he constructed, the priests he installed, the converts he made, willing or otherwise, would remember him as the founder of their faith. He thought Norway would be his monument. Instead, Norway gave that honor to a man who came after him, a man who benefited from everything Olaf had accomplished without having to bear the full weight of everything Olaf had done. The injustice is obvious. Whether Olaf would have felt it as an injustice is less clear. He was not, as far as we can tell, a man much concerned with his own reputation. He cared about power. He cared about victory. He cared about the spread of Christianity for reasons that may have been genuine piety, or may have been political calculation, or may have been some combination that he himself could not have disentangled. But legacy, the question of how he would be remembered after death, seems not to have occupied him the way it occupied some rulers. He was too busy trying to survive. He was too busy trying to conquer. He was too busy holding together a kingdom that was held together mostly by his own will and his own violence, and that began to fall apart the moment he was no longer there to maintain it. The kingdom fell apart. This needs to be understood because it frames everything that came after. Olaf had unified Norway through force. He had suppressed the regional jarls through intimidation and violence. He had made himself the center of a political system that depended entirely on his personal presence, his personal charisma, his personal capacity for brutality. When he disappeared beneath the waters of Svolder, that system disappeared with him. Swine Forkbeard took Norway. This was the immediate consequence of the battle. The Danish king claimed the Norwegian throne as a prize of war, ruling through proxies and regional strongmen who owed their positions to Danish support rather than Norwegian loyalty. The jarls who had betrayed Olaf were rewarded with power and territory. The jarls who had supported Olaf were killed or exiled or forced into submission. The church that Olaf had tried to establish, the priests, the bishops, the physical infrastructure of Christianity, survived but barely. Without royal patronage, without the threat of royal violence, the conversion that Olaf had imposed began to fray at the edges. The temples did not immediately reopen. The old gods did not immediately return. But the pressure eased. The people who had converted under duress, and there were many, perhaps most, found themselves free to practice whatever hybrid faith they had actually believed in all along. They kept the crosses that Olaf had given them. They also kept the small carvings of Thor and Freya that they had hidden during his reign. They baptized their children and also made quiet offerings at the old sacred sites. They said the prayers that the priests had taught them and also told the stories that their grandparents had told. Christianity had arrived in Norway. Whether it would stay was still an open question. This is the context in which the sagas were eventually written. 200 years after Svolder, when Icelandic authors began to compile the histories of the Norwegian kings, they did so in a Norway that had become thoroughly Christian, but Christian in a particular way, shaped by the memory of conversion, shaped by the knowledge that the faith had been imposed through violence, shaped by a complicated relationship with the kings who had done the imposing. The saga writers knew that Olaf Tryggvason was important. They knew that he deserved a prominent place in the narrative, but they also knew that he was difficult to admire without reservation, difficult to condemn without acknowledging his achievements, difficult to fit into the neat categories of hero and villain that saga literature usually employed. So they made him larger than life. They gave him miracles. They gave him prophecies. They gave him a charisma so overwhelming that men would die for him willingly. A physical beauty so striking that even his enemies were impressed, a spiritual destiny so clear that his conversion of Norway seemed not just a political project, but a divine mandate. They made him, in other words, into a legend. And legends do not require the same moral consistency that historical figures require. A legend can be both the torturer and the saint, both the slave and the king, both the man who drowned and the man who might still be waiting somewhere to return. The waiting was important. It became part of the story, not just for Olaf, but for a certain type of hero, a certain type of king, a certain type of figure who disappears rather than dies, and who therefore remains available for future hope. Arthur has it, Frederick Barbarossa has it, Sebastian of Portugal has it, the sleeping king beneath the mountain, waiting for the hour of greatest need. It is one of the oldest patterns in European folklore, and Olaf Tryggvason fits it exactly. He did not die on a deck surrounded by witnesses. He did not fall to a sword that could be identified, wielded by an enemy who could be named. He went down into the water, and the water kept him, and what the water keeps can always, theoretically, be returned. The return never came. This should be stated plainly, because the historical record is clear. Whatever happened to Olaf Tryggvason's body after Svolder, it did not emerge from the sea. The man was gone. The rumors of his survival were rumors only, maintained by hope and fear and the human need for narrative closure that reality had denied. Swine ruled Norway through his proxies until his death in 1014. The jarls squabbled and competed and occasionally killed each other. The church struggled and persisted and gradually strengthened. And Norway waited, not consciously, not deliberately, but in the way that a country waits for the leader who will finally make sense of its identity. For the second Olaf, the one who would give them a saint and a story and a sense of who they were supposed to be. That waiting took 30 years. A generation grew up in a Norway that remembered Olaf Tryggvason as a figure from childhood, a name in stories, a king who had been there, and then suddenly was not. They knew the violence of his reign secondhand. They knew the Christianity he had imposed through the churches that remained, the priests who still performed their rituals, the holidays that had displaced the old festivals. They were neither pagan nor fully Christian, neither loyal to the memory of Olaf nor entirely free of it. They were, in other words, Norwegians, people of a country that had not yet decided what being Norwegian meant. The cold persists. This is worth returning to because the physical reality of Scandinavia shaped everything that happened there. The summers are short, the winters are long. The growing season is constrained by latitude in ways that limited population, limited surplus, limited the kind of wealth that could support elaborate state structures. The kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden were not the kingdoms of France or England. They were poorer, smaller, more dependent on trade and raiding and the extraction of resources from unwilling neighbors. A king in Norway ruled over a scattered population in a difficult landscape, connected by water rather than roads, loyal to local leaders rather than distant crowns. Holding such a kingdom together required constant effort. Olaf had made that effort. His successors, the Danish proxies and the ambitious jarls, made it less successfully. The landscape did not care. The fjords remained, the mountains remained, the sea remained, cold and indifferent and full of fish that could be traded for the grain that Norway could not grow in sufficient quantities. The people adapted, as people do, to whatever conditions present themselves. They raided when raiding was profitable. They traded when trading was possible. They converted to Christianity when conversion was required and reverted to older practices when the pressure eased. They were practical people, shaped by a practical environment, and Olaf Tryggvason's grand project of religious transformation was, for most of them, simply another set of requirements to navigate. But something had changed. This is the part of the story that the saga writers understood, even if they did not articulate it explicitly. Before Olaf, Norway had been a collection of regions loosely connected by language and culture, but not by any meaningful political unity. After Olaf, even after his defeat, even after his death, even after the Danish takeover, the idea of Norway as a single kingdom persisted. He had created something, not through his Christianity but through his kingship, through the simple act of claiming to rule the whole country and acting as though that claim were legitimate. The claim survived him. The reality of Norwegian unity would take another century to fully emerge, but the idea had been planted, and ideas are harder to kill than kings. The sea kept what it took. The silt covered what sank. The crabs did their work and the bacteria did their work, and the slow processes of decomposition transformed whatever remained of Olaf Tryggvason into something unrecognizable. His bones, if they survived, scattered across the seafloor. His armor rusted and corroded. His sword, if he had been holding one, if he had not lost it in the final moments of fighting, became a lump of iron among the sand and the shells. 1,000 years passed. The Baltic remained cold. The Sound between Denmark and Sweden remained navigable, though the ships that crossed it changed from dragon-prowed longships to merchant vessels to steamers to container ships. The battlefield of Svolder became a shipping lane, then a ferry route, then simply another stretch of water that nobody thought about unless they were crossing it. The name survived in books and maps. The reality faded into the kind of abstraction that history becomes when enough time has passed. And yet, the name persisted. Olaf Tryggvason, the king who Christianized Norway, the king who leapt, the king who was never found. The stories continued to be told, first in sagas and then in histories, and then in documentaries and podcasts and YouTube videos, the medium changing while the fascination remained. What is it about this man that we cannot let go of? What is it about his story that continues to compel attention a millennium after his death? Perhaps it is the arc. The slave boy who became a king. The pattern is satisfying in ways that resist analysis. It suggests that the universe is orderly, that suffering can be redeemed, that the powerless can become powerful through will and luck and the strange currents of historical chance. It is not true, of course. Most slave boys stayed slave boys. Most of the powerless remained powerless. But the exceptions fascinate us precisely because they are exceptions, because they suggest possibilities that ordinary life denies. Perhaps it is the contradiction, the Christian who tortured for Christ, the converter who killed those who would not convert, the man who believed, or acted as though he believed, that salvation was worth any cost, including the cost of becoming a monster in the service of what he understood as love. We do not know how to feel about such a figure. We cannot simply admire him because his methods were monstrous. We cannot simply condemn him because his goals were, by the standards of his faith and his time, righteous. He occupies a moral space that refuses resolution, and that refusal is itself compelling. Perhaps it is the ending, the leap, the water, the absence, a death that is not quite a death, a conclusion that is not quite a conclusion, a final image that the imagination can complete in whatever way it prefers. He jumped, he sank, he was never found. The possibilities multiply. He drowned in darkness, he was taken up to heaven, he swam to shore and lived out his days as a nameless hermit. He is still down there, somehow, sleeping beneath the waves, waiting for the call that will bring him back to a Norway that still needs him. None of these stories are true. All of them are satisfying in ways that the truth, a man drowned and decomposed, cannot match. The truth is sufficient. This is what the sources give us when we read them carefully, when we strip away the miracles and the legends and the political motivations of the writers. A man lived. He was born into suffering and rose to power. He used that power to transform his country through methods that were brutal even by the standards of a brutal age. He was betrayed by allies and defeated by enemies. He died. The water took him. The water keeps what it takes. It has been keeping him for more than 1,000 years. The Baltic is still cold. The currents still move through the Sound, carrying silt and nutrients and the tiny organisms that make their living in darkness. Somewhere on that seafloor, in a location that no one will ever identify with certainty, whatever remained of Olaf Tryggvason's physical form completed its transformation into something else: sediment, mineral, the raw material of future geology. The king became the earth became the sea remained indifferent to all of it. And yet, indifference is not the same as absence. The sea does not remember, but people do. And the people who remembered Olaf Tryggvason had reasons for their remembering that had nothing to do with accuracy and everything to do with use. Within a generation of Svolder, the stories were already multiplying. The skalds who had praised him in life continued praising him in death, their verses preserved in the courts of men who had political reasons to honor his memory or condemn it. The Norwegian jarls who ruled under Danish supremacy after the year 1000 needed a martyr, a symbol of what Norway had been before foreign domination, and Olaf served that purpose admirably. He had been Norwegian. He had been a king. He had been defeated not by his own weakness, but by treachery, by the combined might of enemies who feared him too much to face him alone. This narrative, the narrative of the betrayed hero, proved remarkably durable. It appears in virtually every subsequent telling of his life, and it served the interests of virtually everyone who told it. The Danes had their own uses for the story. For them, Olaf was a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened to Norwegian kings who grew too powerful, too ambitious, too independent. His defeat at Svolder was not tragedy, but justice, the natural consequence of overreach, the inevitable fate of a man who had made too many enemies. Swine Forkbeard, who had orchestrated the alliance that destroyed him, needed Olaf to be a villain, or at least a fool. The Danish court poets obliged. The Swedes remembered him differently still. For Eric the Victorious and his successors, Olaf was simply an obstacle that had been removed, a competitor for Baltic dominance whose destruction had opened possibilities that Sweden was only beginning to explore. His story mattered to them primarily as a demonstration of Swedish martial prowess, evidence that Swedish arms could triumph even against the most formidable opponents. 3 kingdoms, 3 memories, 3 versions of the same man shaped by the political needs of those who preserved them. And then there were the ecclesiastical memories, which were different from all of these and ultimately more influential. The church that Olaf had served with such brutal dedication had complicated feelings about its champion. On the one hand, he had Christianized Norway. He had forced baptisms on thousands, built churches, destroyed temples, killed for Christ. These were accomplishments that the church hierarchy valued and wanted to celebrate. On the other hand, his methods had been, even by medieval standards, excessive. The mutilations, the burnings, the coercion. These things were harder to celebrate, harder to fit into the narrative of Christian expansion that the church wanted to tell about itself. The solution, gradually, was to emphasize the results while minimizing the methods, to remember Olaf as the king who brought Norway to Christ while forgetting, or at least not dwelling upon, exactly how he had done it. This selective memory proved remarkably successful. By the time the sagas were written down, 2 centuries after Svolder, Olaf Tryggvason had become something approaching a saint in popular memory, if not in official canonization. His cruelties were acknowledged but explained away as the necessary harshness of a man dealing with stubborn pagans. His forced baptisms were recast as acts of mercy. What could be more merciful than saving souls from damnation, even if the saving required a certain amount of coercion? His victims were transformed from human beings with their own beliefs and values into obstacles to salvation, impediments to the divine plan that Olaf had been sent to execute. The transformation was not complete, and it was not universal. Some of the saga writers preserve details that complicate the saintly image: the blinding of Raud, the torture of the Sidemen, the threats and violence that accompanied every conversion. These writers were honest enough, or perhaps simply narrative-minded enough, to recognize that the interesting thing about Olaf was not his sanctity but his complexity. A simple saint would not have held their attention. A man who was simultaneously a servant of Christ and a monster in Christ's service, that was a figure worth writing about. But the complexity gradually faded as the centuries accumulated. By the time Norway became a modern nation-state, Olaf Tryggvason had been simplified into a founder, a national hero, a king whose Christianity was part of the story of Norwegian civilization. His methods were either forgotten or reframed as the unfortunate necessities of a violent age. His victims were invisible, their perspectives unrecorded, their objections to being forcibly converted lost in the triumph narrative that Christian and nationalist historiography combined to produce. This is how memory works. It serves the living at the expense of the dead. It preserves what is useful and discards what is inconvenient. It turns complex human beings into symbols, flattens contradiction into coherence, transforms the ambiguous mess of actual history into stories that mean something. And the stories about Olaf Tryggvason meant something very specific: that Norway was Christian, that it had always been Christian, or at least been destined to become Christian, that the transition from paganism to Christianity was natural, inevitable, fundamentally good, even if occasionally messy. The people who were blinded for refusing baptism have no memorial. The Sidemen who were drowned on the Skerry have no feast day. The farmers who watched their sacred groves burned and their ancestral practices criminalized left no record of their grief or their resistance. They existed. They mattered. Their suffering was real. And the sources that preserve Olaf's memory preserve them only as obstacles to his success, problems to be solved, pagans to be converted or killed. This is the shadow passage. This is the part of the story that resists celebration, that complicates the arc of the slave boy become king, that refuses to let us simply admire the man who leapt from the long serpent and was never found. He was a killer. He was a torturer. He was a terrorist in the service of his faith. These are not interpretations. They are facts, recorded in the same sources that celebrate his kingship and mourn his defeat. The distinction between Olaf the Christianizer and Olaf the Brutalizer is not a distinction the sources make. They present both figures as the same man, apparently seeing no contradiction between piety and cruelty. The contradiction is ours. We are the ones who want our heroes to be simple, who struggle to hold admiration and horror in the same mental space, who find it difficult to accept that someone can be genuinely devoted to what they understand as good while doing things that we recognize as evil. But this is what history gives us when we are honest about it. People who believed they were doing right while doing wrong, people whose moral clarity produced moral catastrophe, people whose devotion to salvation created suffering that salvation cannot redeem. Olaf Tryggvason forced Norway to become Christian. His successors completed the work he started, and within a few generations the old beliefs were gone, suppressed, forgotten, surviving only in place names and folk practices that the people who preserved them no longer understood. The temples were destroyed. The gods were reduced to stories, then to superstitions, then to archaeological evidence. The worldview that had organized Norse existence for centuries was replaced by a new worldview, one that came from the Mediterranean and had its own assumptions about the nature of reality, the purpose of human life, the relationship between the living and the dead. This was a transformation of staggering scope. We are so accustomed to Christian Europe that we sometimes forget that it required centuries of effort to produce, that the faith which seems natural in retrospect had to be imposed through persuasion and pressure, and, in many cases, violence. Olaf Tryggvason was one of the imposers. He was one of the men who stood at the hinge point when the old world was dying and the new world was being born, and pushed as hard as he could to ensure that the new world would win. Whether this was good or bad is not a question that history can answer. It depends on what you value, what you believe, how you weigh costs against benefits across 1,000 years of consequence. The Christian civilization that emerged from the conversion of Scandinavia produced cathedrals and universities, legal codes and philosophical systems, art and literature and music that continue to shape human experience. It also produced crusades and inquisitions, witch trials and religious wars, systems of thought that justified slavery and colonialism, and the subordination of women. All of these things are connected to the choices made by men like Olaf Tryggvason in the decades around the year 1000. All of them are part of his legacy, whether he could have imagined them or not. The sources do not ask us to make this judgment. They simply record what happened and let us draw our own conclusions. A man was born into slavery. He rose to power. He used that power to transform his country. He was defeated and killed. The water took him. Everything that followed, the completion of Norwegian Christianity, the Norwegian resistance to Danish rule, the eventual emergence of Norway as an independent nation, the long centuries of European history that flowed from the religious settlement that Olaf helped to establish. All of it happened in his absence, shaped by his actions but no longer controlled by them. He had planted something. He did not live to see it grow. And perhaps this is the deepest source of the fascination, not the arc of his life, not the contradiction of his methods, not even the mystery of his ending, but the gap between intention and consequence, the space between what a person does and what that doing eventually means. Olaf Tryggvason thought he was saving souls. He was also building a civilization, destroying a culture, setting in motion chains of causation that would extend for a millennium and more. He could not have known this. He could not have imagined the cathedrals that would rise, or the heresies that would be suppressed, or the distant lands that would be conquered in the name of the faith he championed. He was operating in the present, making decisions for immediate reasons, pursuing goals that seemed achievable and clear. The rest, the vast downstream consequences that make his life historically significant, was invisible to him. This is true of everyone, of course. None of us can see the full consequences of our actions. None of us know which of our choices will prove decisive and which will vanish without trace. But in most lives, this invisibility doesn't matter, because most lives don't produce consequences that extend beyond their immediate context. Olaf's life did. His choices mattered in ways that he could not have foreseen, and the gap between his intentions and his effects is large enough to be visible from 1,000 years away. He wanted to convert Norway. He succeeded. He wanted to rule Norway as a Christian king. He succeeded for a while until his enemies combined against him. He wanted to survive the Battle of Svolder. He failed. He wanted, if the sagas are right about his final leap, to escape capture, to deny his enemies the satisfaction of parading him in chains through the streets of their capitals. He succeeded, if success means disappearing so completely that no one could claim him. But he could not have wanted what actually happened, because what actually happened extended so far beyond his life that wanting it would have been meaningless. He could not have wanted to become a symbol, a founder, a figure in the national mythology of a country that would not exist for centuries. He could not have wanted to become a problem for historians, a case study in religious violence, a name that would still be spoken a millennium after his death. These things were not available to want. They were consequences, not intentions, and the distinction matters. This is why we tell stories about people like Olaf Tryggvason. Not because they were better or worse than other people. They were neither, simply human beings operating under particular constraints with particular resources. But because the consequences of their lives were large enough that we can see them clearly, trace them through time, connect them to our own present in ways that we cannot connect to the countless millions of people who lived and died without leaving visible traces. The slave boy who became a king left traces. The Christian who tortured for Christ left traces. The man who leapt into darkness left traces. And we are still finding them, still reading the sources that preserve his memory, still arguing about what he meant and whether he was right and how we should feel about him. There are no answers to these arguments that will satisfy everyone. The sources are too sparse, the moral questions too difficult, the gap between his world and ours too large for confident judgment. But the arguments continue, and their continuation is itself a kind of memorial, an acknowledgement that this man mattered, that his choices had weight, that his life was not simply his own, but became part of the common inheritance that connects us to the past. The long serpent broke apart under Danish and Swedish arrows and was never rebuilt. The kingdom that Olaf ruled was absorbed into the Danish sphere of influence and would not regain full independence for centuries. The Christianity that he forced upon Norway became so naturalized that people forgot it had ever been forced, forgot that there was ever a time when Norwegians worshipped different gods and organized their lives by different principles. The violence that accomplished this transformation was sanitized, minimized, eventually forgotten by everyone except specialists who studied the period and found in the sources the record of what had actually been done. But forgetting is not the same as erasure. The sources remain. The saga writers, for all their biases and their narrative priorities, preserved enough detail that we can see through their celebrations to the cruelties beneath. They recorded the tortures and the forced baptisms and the killings, because these things were part of the story, because a conversion that cost nothing would have been less impressive than a conversion that required blood. They were proud of what Olaf had done, or at least they wanted their audiences to be proud, and their pride preserved evidence that we can now read differently, against the grain of their intentions, recovering the perspectives they marginalized and the voices they silenced. This is always the possibility with historical sources. They preserve more than their creators intended. The biases that shape them are visible to later readers in ways they were not visible to the original audience. The gaps and silences that made sense in one context become glaring in another. We cannot make the sources say things they do not say. We cannot invent testimony from Olaf's victims or create perspectives that the record does not contain. But we can read what is there with attention to what is missing, and that attention is itself a kind of recovery. The sidemen drowned on the scary. We do not know their names. We do not know what they believed or how they understood their practice or what they said as the tide rose around them. We know only that they existed, that they were killed, that their deaths were recorded as a victory for Christ. This is not much. It is better than nothing. It acknowledges that they were real, that their suffering was real, that the story of Olaf's conversion campaign is not only a story of Christian triumph, but also a story of pagan loss. And perhaps this acknowledgement is the best we can do. Not to pretend that we can recover what is lost, we cannot, but to refuse to participate in its erasure. To hold both the triumph and the loss in the same account. To recognize that Olaf Tryggvason was both a founder and a destroyer, that his achievement and his cruelty were not separate things but aspects of the same project, that the Christian Norway he built was built on foundations that included coercion and violence and the suppression of everything that had come before. The stones he placed in that foundation are still there. They bear weight. And occasionally, when we look carefully, we can see the marks of the hands that shaped them and the shadows of the hands that were crushed beneath them. The year 1000 approached like a tide that no one could stop. Across Christendom, there were those who believed the millennium would bring the end of all things, that Christ would return, that the dead would rise, that the world as it had been would be consumed in the fires of judgment. In Rome and Paris and the great monasteries of the Frankish lands, monks counted the years with something between anticipation and dread. But in the north, the millennium meant something different. It meant that a generation had passed since the first serious Christian missions had arrived in Scandinavia. It meant that the old world was dying not in apocalyptic fire, but in the slower flames of cultural transformation, village by village, family by family, God by God. And it meant that Olaf Tryggvason, who had done more than any single man to accelerate that transformation in Norway, was running out of time. He could not have known this. No one can see the shape of their own ending while they are still inside it. But looking back, we can see the convergence of forces that would destroy him, the alliances forming in the shadows, the grievances accumulating, the enemies who had learned to fear him deciding that fear was no longer enough. Olaf had spent 5 years building Christian Norway with methods that created as many enemies as converts. The chieftains he had humiliated, the families he had broken, the jarls he had displaced. They had not forgotten. They had simply waited. And now, in the summer of the year 1000, their waiting was almost over. The immediate cause of the crisis was, as so often in this period, a marriage negotiation. Olaf had been seeking to strengthen his position through alliance with one of the great Scandinavian powers, and his attention had fallen on Sigrid the Haughty, the widow of the Swedish king Eric the Victorious and one of the most formidable women of her age. The sagas describe her as proud, beautiful, and dangerous, a woman who had burned previous suitors alive in her hall when they proved unworthy of her standards. Whether this is literally true or a narrative embellishment designed to establish her character, the point is clear. Sigrid was not someone to be trifled with, and Olaf, in the confidence of his power and the certainty of his faith, trifled with her. The meeting between them, as the sagas tell it, was a disaster. Olaf demanded that Sigrid convert to Christianity as a condition of marriage. She refused. She would not, she said, abandon the faith of her ancestors for any man, not even a king. And Olaf, in a moment of rage that would cost him everything, struck her across the face with his glove. He called her a heathen bitch. He told her she was unworthy of a Christian king. And Sigrid, holding her cheek where he had struck her, looked at him with cold eyes and said words that the saga writers preserved because they understood their weight. "This may well be your death." She married Sweyn Forkbeard instead. Sweyn was the king of Denmark, the son of Harald Bluetooth, who had first brought Christianity to the Danes. He was ambitious, patient, and ruthless, a man who understood that power in Scandinavia was not held but constantly contested, that kings survived only as long as they could outmaneuver their rivals. He had been watching Olaf Tryggvason's rise with the same calculating attention that a wolf gives to a rival entering its territory. And now, with Sigrid at his side and her hatred burning in his ear, he had the motivation to act on what calculation had long suggested, that Olaf was vulnerable, that his Christian zealotry had created divisions that could be exploited, that the moment to strike would come. The alliance that formed against Olaf was the most formidable combination of power that Scandinavia had seen in generations. Sweyn Forkbeard brought the resources of Denmark, the wealthiest and most organized of the Scandinavian kingdoms, with a fleet that had been built over decades and a tradition of naval warfare that went back to the first great raids. Olaf Skotkonung, the king of Sweden, brought the eastern flank, a guarantee that Olaf would receive no help from that direction, and additional ships to swell the attacking fleet. And Eric Hakonarsson, the son of the Jarl whom Olaf had driven from Norway 5 years earlier, brought the legitimacy of Norwegian opposition, proof that this was not simply foreign aggression, but a restoration, a reclaiming of what had been stolen. Eric Hakonarsson is a figure worth pausing on because he represents everything that Olaf had tried to destroy and failed to eliminate. His father, Håkon Sigurdsson, had been the last great pagan ruler of Norway, a man who had maintained the old religion against Christian pressure, who had rebuilt the temples that earlier kings had damaged, who had been a devoted worshipper of the gods that Olaf now burned and drowned. When Olaf seized power in 995, Eric had fled to Sweden with his brother Svein. He had spent 5 years in exile, nursing his hatred, building his connections, waiting for the chance to return. Now that chance had come. The Christian king who had forced Norway to abandon its gods would face a coalition that included the son of the last great defender of those gods. The symmetry was too perfect to be accidental. It was the kind of thing that saga writers lived for. The summer of Ahausen was unusually warm. The seas were calm, the winds favorable for sailing. Olaf Tryggvason gathered his fleet for what he believed would be a routine expedition, a journey to Venland on the southern coast of the Baltic, where he had business to conduct and allies to meet. He took with him his best ships, including the Long Serpent, the greatest warship in Scandinavia. He took his most loyal warriors, his household troops, the men who had fought beside him in England and followed him back to claim his kingdom. He did not take enough of them. The sources disagree on the exact size of Olaf's fleet. Some say 11 ships, some say more. What is consistent is that it was smaller than what he had available, that he left much of his naval power behind in Norway because he did not expect to need it. This was not mere carelessness. It was a calculated decision based on intelligence that turned out to be wrong. Olaf believed the route was safe. He believed his enemies were occupied elsewhere. He believed that even if he encountered trouble, the Long Serpent and his veteran crews could fight their way through anything. He was wrong about all of it. The ambush was laid at Svolder. The exact location of Svolder has been debated by scholars for centuries. Some place it near the island of Rügen, others in the Øresund Strait between Denmark and Sweden, still others at various points along the Baltic coast. The uncertainty is fitting. The place where Olaf Tryggvason met his end has become as much a myth as the man himself, a location that exists more in story than in geography. But somewhere in those cold northern waters, on a day in early September, the trap was sprung. Olaf's fleet was sailing in formation, the Long Serpent at the center as befitted the king's ship, the other vessels arrayed around it like a protective shell. The morning was clear. The sea was calm. And then, emerging from behind a headland or an island or whatever geographical feature had concealed them, the Allied fleet appeared. The numbers were overwhelming. The sagas speak of 70 ships, of 100, of a fleet so vast that it darkened the water. The exact count does not matter. What matters is that Olaf and his 11 vessels faced a force that outnumbered them by margins that made conventional victory impossible. The Danes came from one direction, the Swedes from another, the Norwegian exiles from a third. They had coordinated their approach perfectly, closing off every avenue of escape, surrounding the smaller fleet like wolves around a wounded deer. Olaf could have run. With the Long Serpent's speed and his crew's skill, he might have broken through the encirclement before it closed completely. Some of his captains urged exactly this: flight, while flight was still possible, survival to fight another day, a strategic withdrawal that would preserve the king and the core of his forces for future campaigns. But Olaf refused. Whether from pride or honor or simple miscalculation, he chose to stand and fight. "I have never fled from battle," he said, according to the sagas. "I will not begin now." The ships were lashed together, their sides bound with ropes to create a floating platform from which the crews could fight as a single unit. This was standard Norse naval tactics. It transformed a sea battle into something more like a land engagement, giving the defenders a stable surface and allowing them to concentrate their strength. The Long Serpent anchored the center of the formation, its towering sides giving Olaf's men the advantage of height against any attacker who tried to board. Around it, the other ships formed a perimeter, their crews manning the rails with bows and spears and the grim knowledge that there would be no reinforcement, no relief, no escape except through victory. The attack began with arrows. The Allied fleet maintained its distance at first, pouring missile fire into the clustered Norwegian ships. The advantage of numbers meant that the attackers could rotate fresh crews forward while the defenders exhausted themselves against waves of assault that seemed to have no end. Shields splintered under the barrage. Men fell with arrows in their throats, their chests, their faces. The deck of the Long Serpent grew slippery with blood, and the battle had barely begun. Then the boarding began. The Danish ships came first, their prows crashing against the outer vessels of Olaf's formation. Warriors leaped across the gaps, axes swinging, shields raised against the defenders who met them at the rails. The fighting was close and brutal, the kind of combat where skill mattered less than endurance, where victory went to whoever could keep killing longer. The outer ships were taken one by one, their crews overwhelmed by sheer numbers, their survivors retreating to the inner vessels as the perimeter collapsed. The Swedish ships came next, striking from a different angle, forcing Olaf's men to divide their attention between multiple threats. The formation was breaking apart now, the lashed vessels separating under the stress of combat and the pressure of the attackers. Ships that had been part of the defensive line became isolated, surrounded, taken. Their crews died where they stood or jumped into the water and drowned in their armor. Through it all, Olaf fought from the deck of the Long Serpent. The saga descriptions of his performance that day have the quality of legend, but behind the embellishment there is a core of something that might be memory. They describe a king who seemed to be everywhere at once, who threw spears with both hands simultaneously, who cut down attackers faster than they could reach him. They describe a warrior of supernatural ability, holding the greatest ship in Scandinavia against the combined might of 3 kingdoms. And they describe something else, a man who knew he was going to die and had decided to make his death mean something. The fighting lasted for hours. The sun moved across the sky and began its descent toward the western horizon. The Allied fleet had lost ships of its own, lost men in numbers that would be mourned in Denmark and Sweden and the Norwegian exile communities for years to come. But they could afford the losses. Olaf could not. One by one, his ships were taken or destroyed until only the Long Serpent remained, the greatest warship in Scandinavia, now alone against a fleet that still numbered in the dozens. Erik Hakanarsson himself led the final assault. This was personal for Erik in a way it was not for the Danish and Swedish kings. They wanted Olaf's kingdom. Erik wanted revenge. His father had been driven to a humiliating death by this man. His family's legacy had been erased. The gods his people had worshipped for centuries had been drowned and burned by Olaf's order. Now, finally, the son would have justice. The Long Serpent was boarded from every direction. The few defenders who remained were pushed back toward the stern, fighting over the bodies of their fallen comrades. Olaf stood at the highest point of the ship, the raised platform at the stern where captains commanded and kings made their final stands. Around him, his last loyal men fell, cut down, pierced, overwhelmed by numbers that made courage irrelevant. And then Olaf was alone. The sagas describe what happened next with a precision that suggests someone was watching, someone survived to tell the tale, someone remembered and passed the memory down through generations until it reached the writers who recorded it. Olaf Tryggvason, King of Norway, the man who had survived slavery and exile and a decade of Viking warfare across 3 continents, the man who had forced a nation to its knees and compelled it to accept a new god. This man looked at the enemies surrounding him, at the bodies of his warriors piled on the blood-slicked deck, at the Swedish and Danish and Norwegian traders who had destroyed his fleet and now wanted to take him alive. He raised his shield above his head. He stepped to the rail. He jumped. The Long Serpent was high-sided, the tallest ship of its age. The fall to the water was significant. And Olaf was wearing armor, the mailcoat that had protected him through hours of combat, the helmet that had turned aside blows meant to kill him, the weight of iron and steel that had been his defense and now became his doom. He hit the water, and he sank. They never found his body. The Allied fleet searched for him as the sun set over Svolder. They sent boats to probe the waters where he had gone down. They waited through the night in case he surfaced somewhere, in case he had somehow escaped, in case this was another trick by a man who had made his career out of surviving what should have been unsurvivable. But the sea kept its secret. Olaf Tryggvason was gone. The disappearance became its own kind of legend. In the years and decades that followed, there were stories, persistent, repeated, never quite confirmed, that Olaf had survived, that he had slipped out of his armor beneath the waves, that he had been rescued by a ship that no one saw, that he had swum to shore and made his way east to the lands where he had spent his youth. Some said he went to the Holy Land on pilgrimage. Some said he entered a monastery in Jerusalem or Greece or Syria. Some said he lived for decades as a hermit, praying for the souls of those he had killed, seeking forgiveness for the methods he had used to build the Christian kingdom that outlasted him. None of these stories are true, or rather, we have no evidence that any of them are true, and considerable reason to believe they are exactly what they appear to be. The myths that accumulate around any figure whose end is sufficiently dramatic and sufficiently ambiguous. People do not want their heroes to die. They want escape routes, survival narratives, the possibility that the story is not really over. Olaf gave them that possibility by jumping instead of surrendering, by leaving no body to be buried or desecrated or displayed. The mystery of his end became part of his legend, and the legend grew in the telling. What we can say with confidence is this: Olaf Tryggvason ruled Norway for 5 years and reshaped it forever. The Christianity he forced upon his people took root so deeply that within a few generations it was simply how Norwegians understood themselves and their world. The violence he used was forgotten or minimized or reframed as regrettable necessity. The victims, the sidemen drowned on the Skerry, the farmers mutilated for resisting, the communities burned for holding to the old ways, were erased from the story except as obstacles that the triumphant faith had overcome. The kingdom did not survive him. Erik Håkonarson took Norway as a vassal state under Danish overlordship, and for the next several decades, the country was effectively a dependency of the more powerful Scandinavian realm. But the church survived. The priests stayed. The bishops continued their work of organization and consolidation. By the time Norway regained full independence under Olaf's distant successors, Christianity was so thoroughly established that the question was no longer whether Norway would be Christian, but what kind of Christianity it would practice. This is the paradox that Olaf's life presents to anyone who tries to understand it honestly. He was a founder, but what he founded was not the kingdom he ruled, that collapsed almost immediately after his death. What he founded was a religious transformation that outlasted every political structure of his age. He was a destroyer, but what he destroyed was not simply paganism. It was an entire way of understanding the world, a cosmology, a set of relationships between humans and the divine that had organized Scandinavian life for centuries. He was a tyrant who used torture and murder to impose his will on people who had never consented to his rule. He was also a builder who created something that billions of people now take for granted as simply the way things are. The sea at Svolder does not remember any of this. The waves that closed over Olaf Tryggvason that September evening have risen and fallen billions of times since. The place where he drowned, wherever it was, has been crossed by countless ships carrying cargoes he could not have imagined to destinations he never knew existed. The world moved on. It always does. But the stones remain. In the churches of Norway, there are stones that were laid in foundations during the decades after Olaf's death. Some of them may have been quarried by men whose fathers remembered the old gods, whose grandfathers were present when Olaf's warriors came to enforce the new faith. The hands that shaped those stones are long since dust. The beliefs they held, whether old or new, whether coerced or genuine, are beyond recovery. We cannot know what they thought as they worked, whether they resented the transformation that had been forced upon their people, or whether they had already accepted it as simply the way things were. We cannot know if they remembered the sidemen or the burned temples or the forced baptisms. We cannot know if they cared. But the stones remember nothing and hold everything. They bear the weight of 1,000 years of worship, of prayers spoken in a language that evolved from the tongue Olaf spoke, of ceremonies that trace their lineage back to the choices he made and the violence he used. The stones do not judge. They do not forgive. They simply persist, doing the work that stones do, indifferent to the hands that shaped them and the blood that may have stained the ground beneath them. And somewhere in the Baltic, perhaps near Rügen, perhaps in the Öresund, perhaps at a location that has shifted beyond all recognition as coastlines changed and channels silted and the geography of the north rearranged itself over 10 centuries, there is water that once held a king. It does not hold him anymore. The currents took him. The fish took him. The slow processes of dissolution took him. Olaf Tryggvason became salt and bone and scattered sediment, distributed across a sea that bore his ships and his ambitions and his crimes and his achievements, and ultimately, him. The man who dragged a nation into Christianity against its will, who sailed from slavery to kingship, who built the long serpent and died on its deck, who leapt into the water rather than face his enemy's mercy, that man became part of the sea that made him. This is not tragedy. This is not triumph. This is simply what happens. Kings die, the waters close. The work goes on. In the year 1000, a man jumped from a burning ship into a cold northern sea. The world he left behind has not stopped arguing about him. The water keeps its silence.